All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating science of psychological momentum. And to do that, we're going to look through the lens of one of football's most legendary and honestly most chaotic teams. We're going to see how a single moment of intense sporting injustice doesn't necessarily break a team. In fact, it can trigger this wild psychological snowball effect that turns them into an absolute juggernaut. It turns out, when you bridge gritty 1960s football lore with modern sports psychology, it reveals so much about how the human mind actually reacts when the stakes are at their absolute highest. To really wrap our heads around this, I want you to picture the gritty, chaotic penalty box of 1960s football. You know, this was an era way before video reviews, before pixel-perfect offside lines, and definitely without that sterile mathematical exactness we're so used to today. In this environment, a single blow of a referee's whistle erasing a goal wasn't just some administrative error. It was literally described as a visceral bleeding wound. Think about that. It was a moment of sheer sporting injustice, decided purely on a referee's gut instinct that could either completely shatter a team's spirit or, as we'll see, forge them into a terrifying force.
Part 1. The Phantom Goal. Our story actually kicks off at the 1967 European Cup Final, where Celtic's Bobby Lennox smashed a perfectly legitimate, spectacular strike into the net, only for an offside flag to controversially erase it from history. Now, usually in sports psychology, a massive disallowed goal like this does one of two things, right? It either totally deflates the attacking team and drains their confidence, or it enrages them so much that they make reckless mistakes. But instead of collapsing into despair or wasting time arguing over the injustice, the Celtic players did something truly extraordinary. They made this collective, unspoken decision. If they won't give us one goal, well, we'll just have to score 3. They simply grabbed the ball, restarted play, and attacked all over again.
So the big question is, why did this phantom goal trigger a massive uninhibited siege instead of just destroying the team's morale? Inter Milan totally thought the disallowed goal had saved them. They thought they'd survived the scare. But actually, that was the exact moment they lost control of the match. The Celtic players basically stopped caring about rigid patterns of play. That perceived injustice activated this powerful psychological state where they felt they weren't just playing Inter Milan anymore. They were fighting an entire establishment that was rigged against them.
Part 2. The Science of Momentum. To really decode this incredible reaction, we're going to pivot away from the muddy pitches of 1967 for a minute and step into the halls of modern science.
It turns out there is a fascinating study published in 2020 that captures exactly what happens in human minds during moments like this. A team of researchers from the University of Groningen took 86 competitive male football players and rigorously tested how they reacted to specific, high-stakes match scenarios. They essentially placed these players in hypothetical, high-pressure cup final situations just to measure the profound changes in their mental states when a game's dynamic shifts abruptly.
What these researchers were measuring is a concept called psychological momentum, or PM. At its core, it's the perception of moving toward a desired goal, which is positive PM, or moving away from it, which is negative PM. And you know, this applies way beyond just sports. Think about a time you were falling behind on a project, and suddenly you got an unexpected burst of progress. That mental snowball effect, it triggers a whole network of confidence, a feeling of control, and just immense motivation right inside your brain. The design of this study is brilliantly simple. They asked the players to imagine scoring an equalizer in that cup final, but they changed one critical variable, the timing. They compared the psychological impact of scoring an equalizer in the 61st minute versus pulling off a last-gasp 92nd minute miracle goal. Even though the objective outcome in both scenarios is exactly the same, a 1-1 tie, the researchers wanted to know if the sheer distance to the final whistle altered that psychological momentum. And the findings reveal a truly fascinating pattern. While equalizing always gives you a boost, the psychological spike of doing it incredibly late or overcoming what feels like an insurmountable hurdle makes a team feel literally invincible. It triggers this phenomenon where nearly failing but surviving creates a massive psychological surge. The players experience such intense feelings of confidence and control that it vastly outperforms the momentum they'd get from just a routine goal earlier in the match.
Part 3. Forging a Juggernaut. Now let's jump back to 1967 and see how this academic theory maps directly onto the physical reality of those Celtic players, famously known as the Lisbon Lions.
That perceived injustice we talked about earlier, it transformed a normal attack into a brutal statistical bombardment. Just listen to these numbers, because they are staggering. 43 total shots, 39 corner kicks, 13 massive saves by Inter's legendary goalkeeper Giuliano Sardi. Every single time Celtic won a corner after that disallowed goal, they carried the memory of that injustice with them. They were utterly convinced that they were the better team, and that victory wasn't just possible, it was simply inevitable.
This is the perfect illustration of pure positive momentum. Decades later, Bobby Lennox himself reflected on that game, and he said, if that game had gone to an extra 30 minutes, we would have hammered them. Celtic were so completely in the zone, surfing such a massive wave of psychological momentum that they truly felt they would have utterly embarrassed Inter Milan if the clock had just kept ticking. They wouldn't have even known how to take their foot off the gas. It was a force of nature.
Part 4. The Intercontinental Clash. So we've seen the positive side. But what happens when that exact same relentless psychological momentum meets a diametrically opposed culture, turns incredibly toxic, and descends into utter chaos?
Well, that brings us to the 1967 Intercontinental Cup against Argentina's Racing Club. This wasn't just one match, it was a grueling three-leg saga starting in Glasgow, moving all the way to Buenos Aires, and ending in a final playoff in Montevideo, Uruguay. This series would test the very limits of sporting sanity.
Things got terrifying in the second leg at Racing Stadium in Buenos Aires, notoriously called the Cylinder. Before the game even kicked off, as Celtic goalkeeper Ronnie Simpson took his position, he was struck in the head by a projectile thrown from a fiercely partisan crowd of 120,000 fans. He was knocked flat out, had to be completely replaced. It was a horrifically hostile welcome, and it instantly shifted the players' psychological momentum from a quest for sporting victory into a primal need for physical survival.
Part 5, the Battle of Montevideo. By the time they reached the neutral third leg in Uruguay, all that hostility finally boiled over. The match completely lost its beauty and descended into pure, unadulterated anarchy.
The momentum here had absolutely nothing to do with scoring goals anymore. It was entirely about survival and retribution. Think about this. The referee blew for 52 free kicks, and he probably missed dozens more. Riot police literally had to storm the pitch carrying swords to intervene. Racing Club saw 2 players dismissed, and Celtic officially got 4 red cards. But the chaos was so absolute that when Celtic's Bertie Auld was sent off, he just ignored the referee. He flat out refused to leave the pitch and played all the way to the final whistle while his team finished with an official count of 7 men. Incredible.
Racing Club ultimately scrapped a 1-0 win, but the aftermath really highlighted the massive cultural divide. The victorious Argentines flew home to be heavily celebrated, literally being gifted cars. Meanwhile, Celtic's chairman Robert Kelly bluntly stated the game contained no football. And get this, he actually heavily fined his own battered players £250 each, which was a massive sum back then, just for allowing themselves to be dragged into such a pugilistic nightmare, completely regardless of the brutal intimidation they had faced.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating final thought for this explainer. We've seen how the psychological momentum sparked by a single disallowed goal can push human endurance to statistical impossibilities, creating this beautiful, unstoppable juggernaut on the pitch. But we've also seen how that exact same intense collective mindset can spiral into complete toxic anarchy when survival is threatened. So, if psychological momentum truly is a force of nature, how much of it is determined by the actual rules of the sport, and how much is decided entirely in the fragile, unpredictable minds of the players themselves?